Hello, everybody. Welcome again. I'm sorry about the voice thing, and because I don't have a voice, tonight I'll be introducing Dana Phelps, who will be doing the Q&A session. Anyway, with that said, hello again. Helen Stacey from the Program on Human Rights, and we're now into our third last of a class that looks at the role of NGOs operating from the United States on human rights issues abroad. Our speaker tonight is Elizabeth Liz Blake, who has been leading the Habitat for Humanity International Government Relations and Advocacy team for nearly 10 years, I believe, in addition to her day job, which is as a lawyer, so she's General Counsel for Habitat for Humanity. She has a law degree from Columbia University and has also worked in the corporate sector. I know of Liz's work because I've been following what's been happening in Haiti. I've supervised a PhD in the law school on the violence against women in Haiti. So I know that Habitat for Humanity has had a big role in the issues of land tenure in Haiti so that there can be reconstruction projects proceeding and security of tenure for people who are building homes, often building homes, not necessarily rebuilding homes. So this means that there's a deep core of legal regulation in your work, I imagine, but also the need to work with the many donors that have gone to Haiti, French, Canadian, US, and to then work with those governments and also donor agencies in pulling together laws and manuals of procedure for land tenure in an area that I guess you could liken to a post-civil conflict area, because it was so razed to the ground and because so much destruction was done to the social infrastructure and community infrastructure. Tonight, instead of me, I'll be resting my voice, my teaching associate and research associate for the Program on Human Rights, Dana Phelps, is going to be doing the Q&A. And most of you know Dana, but you may not know that she's a PhD fellow in the Department of Anthropology here at Stanford. And her work is looking at the intersection of cultural heritage and human rights, especially on the impact of cultural heritage projects on the communities in Albania and Kosovo, who are minority communities. Before she came to Stanford, Dana worked with an international development contractor in Washington, DC. And before that, she worked with the UNESCO World Heritage Center in Paris. She's also worked in Albania, helping NGOs work with local communities in creating sustainable community development projects near archaeological sites. So same format as other nights. Our speaker will speak for 40 or so minutes. Dana will engage with our speaker on the stage in some targeted questions, and then we'll throw the floor open to you. So thanks, Liz. Please come forward.
Expecting a standing ovation at the end of this, so you got to pay attention because otherwise you'll be standing up and wondering why you are. I am going to talk about Habitat for Humanity, but I'm thrilled that everything Helen said is right, except she needed to say retired around my job, because December 1st I retired from Habitat. Habitat's the best place on earth from which to retire, however, because they live and breathe volunteers, and so the work that I am most passionate about, I'm still doing as a volunteer. The title of my talk is The Profile of a 21st Century NGO, talking about Habitat. I'll talk more broadly. I am focused on the human rights aspect of it. We at Habitat look at shelter and land as a human right, although I'm hoping that most of the things I talk about will actually be ones in social anthropology or otherwise where a community-based and focused community-based focus will cause you to be thinking more broadly just than land and shelter. And I think I will have to figure out how to do the next slide. Okay, this is the summary, and if you were going to have an exam from me, which happily you never will, this would be the one thing of your notes that you would want to be looking at. I'm going to talk through this, and then I'm going to come back to it. And it's not because you're academics, you're brilliant academics. It's because I go to a wonderful church, and the pastor speaks in threes. He never says anything just once. And so I want you to get this, so I'm going to say it now. I'll give you some illustrations, then I'll have a sum at the end, with the hope that the questions that you ask me will cause me to be a better person. I love being around smart minds. My stepdaughter went to Stanford. She got in an early decision and thought she was stupid. I know everybody here is brilliant, and I'm expecting you to be able to demonstrate that. And obviously, you're both also brilliant and culturally broad. My premise here, I'm not going to deal with. My premise is that NGOs do harm and are ineffective. I don't need to make that because it would be a dark, awful talk and people would be crying about the waste and harm. And there's a lot of it. But NGOs in the US are so large that it doesn't matter if we're bad or good. We're so important as a force. As you guys have been studying, we actually need to be better anyway. You would want everything to be part of continuous improvement. And in the case of NGOs, NGOs are the employers of 13 million people. They are 10% of the US economy, 2x the national defense. And the revenue annually for NGOs that are US based, they're 14 million, 1.4 million, sorry. The revenue is $1.5 trillion. Annual revenue, $1.5 trillion. So you ought to be thinking about what you guys can do to help NGOs be better going forward, because it's such an important structural part of the world that we live in. I worked for Habitat for a little more than 9 years, retired, but will probably have 20 years under my belt before I fully give it up. And Habitat I was happy to work for because it's a good guy NGO. Habitat doesn't give anything away. There are two exceptions when AIDS parents, both parents are dead, and there is a 15 or 16-year-old boy or girl, usually girl, who is raising her children, and it's her child and her siblings, and she can't really afford to build a house. We give her that house, but only with community support. The only other exception of giveaways is Habitat does give away certain shelter and shelter improvements right after disasters. Otherwise, we don't give anything away. And that's why I say we're a good guy NGO. We're about empowerment. You know, the fish and the fishing and all that. Very few NGOs actually do that. Most NGOs talk about how they empower, and in fact, they're part of a tradition of philanthropy that is based in the 18th century of looking at people who are less good, less prosperous than you, and giving them something as a way to assuage your own feelings. That is really a pretty terrible model when you're looking at 10% of the US economy. That really shouldn't be the way we work. All NGOs are now being held accountable for playing better in the sandbox and being better, and I hope you guys will feel as if the model that I'm laying out gives at least a framework for thinking about the ways in which we could play better. The first is that NGOs need to play well with others, and most don't. Generally, NGOs fight against NGOs for donors, and that just has to end. Very few NGOs have a history of collaboration. Habitat's one of them, partly because we're a federation. We're a model of Habitat International, where I worked, is like the mothership. Think of a franchise, and so it's a federation model, and people have to get along. So it's a different culture. But even within the NGO world, NGOs now have to work, as Helen said, with government agencies at the municipal and local level, as well as the federal level. They need to work with private sector, not just taking their money, picking their pockets as donors, but actually working with them in doing co-development projects. And they need to work with multilaterals and other funding sources that are quasi-governmental, like World Bank, IDB, USAID, DFID, and whatnot. Just think, and you know that you've studied this for however many years, what can be done when it's the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, when it's actually people working together. Well, think about 10% of the economy being levered by partners. The potential's pretty exciting. What would the leverage look like? I have 4 factors here that I think are prerequisites to successful leveraged projects. And these are based upon research I've done, courses I've taken, my 9 years of scar tissue and frequent flyer miles, and some reading. And the 4 really are core, and there's a lot of lip service paid, but they're usually ignored. The first is that you have to think about community development, the focus of most international work, as being asset-based. And that's not your assets. That's the assets of the people whose community is being benefited by a partnership or an engagement. So if you think of people as being poor and having nothing, you don't expect them then to be major actors in the solutions that need to be generated. If you look at them as having assets, and I'll give you some pretty cool examples of it, all of a sudden you've got a different vocabulary, you've got a different circumstance. The second is that the development work, whatever it is, needs to be done based upon what the community says its priorities are. And again, I'll give you some pretty cool illustrations. The third is, this is the fishing piece. You have to do it in a way that people end up better off. And not just for the period of time that the NGO is there driving their 4-wheeled, whatever it is. They actually need to be left with something more. And in the disaster context, it's really strange, but people just think, oh, we can give the water or the emergency relief and leave, without realizing what the structure of the community, and both physically and sociologically and at a community level, what that was beforehand. Habitat was part of the Haiti relief, as Helen said, and Haiti took on the Build Back Better moniker. It's aspirational, but most people don't even think to do that, and it needs to be part of the future going forward. The commitment has to be, therefore, that the local capacity is better off afterwards, not just the physical delivery of goods and services. And finally, the last item here, the buzzword is accompaniment. This is Paul Farmer's word, going from aid to accompaniment, and I'll share a few stories about that. But has anybody, who in the room has heard of Paul Farmer? Okay, that's good. I'll give you the Cliff Note version for the ones that aren't familiar, and you guys can correct me for what I'm wrong. Paul Farmer is a heroic creature, walks a foot above the water, who is a tenured, with lots and lots of names after it, professor at the medical school at Harvard. In 1983, he went, as your age, to Haiti and lived in a squatter community for a couple years. That changed his life, and from then on, after he got his medical degree, he spent approximately 6 months a year doing rural medical service delivery, first in Haiti and then in Rwanda, and created an NGO called Partners in Health, and Partners in Health now works in 12 countries. There was a wonderful book, Mountain Beyond Mountains, that was written about him, and one of the things that I'm going to recommend that you look at is the most recent book that was actually written for you. It's for the next generation, which is a book called To Repair the World, which is his addresses, and one of them I'm going to refer to a bit, which is his address to the Harvard Kennedy School, the commencement address in 2011, and it's talking about aid to accompaniment. And Accompaniment is based upon the Haitian word from the French and I won't bastardize the French, but to accompany, and it actually goes back to the biblical roots, Latin roots, biblical roots of breaking bread together. So accompany, it's the pain from bread, and ac is to come with. And he makes a very persuasive case for the fact that you can't make development be successful unless you are working with and not for the people with whom you want to partner. So it's an accompaniment model, and I hope at the end of it you get excited about it. If, in fact, besides the lip service, if in fact the world behaved this way, we would end up with a new vocabulary, there'd be different players in coalitions, we would be behaving differently, we would have resources, and my own theory, although I don't have the economics yet to back this up, my own theory is it wouldn't be more resources, it would be resources deployed differently. And finally, we would need metrics. And on the metrics, I would commend to your attention the work that is done by Esther Duflo, D-U-F-L-O, who was she's a MacArthur Genius Award winner. She's one of the first, I guess she's the youngest tenured professor at MIT. And she's a pioneer in the policy and research associated with poverty alleviation economics. So how do you measure the impact and how do you measure the cost effectiveness of poverty alleviation? And she's done some really amazing work based upon randomized controlled trials where, again, NGOs, I'm a corporate person, a recovering corporate person who then spent 9 or 10 years in the NGO world. My roots are corporate. I worked for General Electric for 4 years, and I was one layer down from Jack Welch, who said, and there are many versions of this, what gets measured gets done. I live and breathe metrics and measurements, and I got to the NGO world, and they just like doing things because it feels good. And the answer is, well, we want it to feel good. That's good, but you're not going to get the next donor dollar unless you can measure it and you can show there's an effectiveness. And then people go, well, nobody's paying us to measure. And the answer is, well, you ought to actually use some of your own core funding to measure because it's so important. And then the next answer is, well, we can't measure because it takes too long. The things that we do won't actually show results for years. And the answer is, you got to go back in a year or two, and you got to keep measuring, and you got to set it up from the beginning so that you're measuring, because if you don't measure it, it's almost as if it didn't occur. And you guys, as practitioners of the future, need to make sure that what you do actually gets measured and therefore gets valued and therefore continues. I'm going to do a few slides on Habitat. Has anybody been on a Habitat for Humanity build? This is about the only audience I've ever seen this happen in. Has anybody, thank you, there's one hand wearing a Cardinal shirt. Has anybody been on a Habitat for Humanity Global Village trip? Okay, you guys, one or the other, you're in for a treat. Habitat mobilizes 1 million volunteers a year. And we do it because people love to volunteer for Habitat. And why do they love volunteer for Habitat? Because you feel good when you help other people. And you go to a soup kitchen and you work in the kitchen and then you hand the soup across. But it's a we they. You're handing it to somebody, and inherently it's a giver-receiver relationship. When you build on a Habitat house, and Global Village, you just go for a week in a foreign country, usually hot weather, you build on Habitat houses. You are with the partner families. Literally, the person who's going to be living in the room that you're scraping the walls for, or painting, or putting the siding up on, is working with you. And they're working so much harder than you are, and you're going, but I thought I was the one giving. And you're saying, no, 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 no. And it's by the end of the time that you build with them, they are family, you are family, it's not a we, they, and you feel so much better about yourself. And the people that we have volunteer come back and say, I got so much more than I ever could have given. And it's just a wonderful, unique experience. So get out there, habitat.org. The vision of Habitat is a world where everyone has a decent place to live. Habitat is a Christian ministry. And we focus on God, and our mission is to seek to put God's love into action. We are an action ministry. We bring people together, that's the volunteer piece, to build homes, communities, and hope. I got to add the hope at the end when we were doing the new mission statement. I'm very excited about that. And that's really what I see after 9 years. I see the hope in the eyes of the people that I work with, and it's generations of hope that gets created. Habitat is an action ministry, and we have a non-proselytizing policy. We do not try to convert anybody to anything, and in fact, we serve and build families, build with and for partner families of all faiths and no faith. And in fact, in Lebanon, where we work as a post-conflict community building effort, we actually do it for the Jews in Lebanon. So we work in and along with the most vulnerable populations, but we don't try to convert them along the way. Started in 1976. If I wanted to go down the rabbit hole that I would love to, by a guy who was cheating on his wife, so we created a Christian ministry. That probably would take the rest of the day, so I'll quit that. But he had this vision of using building houses in partnership as a new model. And there are now 50 states in the United States, all of whom have Habitat ministries. There are 1,400 plus affiliates. There are 3,000 communities in the world that have Habitat affiliated entities building in them today. And every day, 4,271 people have decent shelter because of Habitat that didn't have it the day before. So it's very cool. We're in 70 countries. We used to be in 107. There was this expansion mode, and we cut back to 70 because of quality control, making sure that the quality was there. And as I mentioned earlier, we work in partnership. We used to count shelters. We used to count physical structures, and we got up to 800,000, and we've, as of this year, stopped counting shelters and are counting people. And roughly in the developing world, it's ×5. In the US, it's ×3 or 4. But conservatively, we've helped more than 3 million worldwide. 90% of the work that Habitat does is outside the US. Most people who are in the US don't know that Habitat works outside the US. And it's something that we need to make change in their view. And I talked about the volunteers. The reason that the 3 million or 4 million, whatever it is not even the source of congratulations, self-congratulations, is that the need is so profound. So we've just finished a strategic plan, and the strategic plan is focusing on what the need is, as opposed to what our capacity is. And the need is 1.6 billion, with a B, it's 1.6 billion who live in poverty housing. The scale of the challenge is about 1 billion people that have no secure tenure, as we talked about earlier, and we'll talk about again, and live without basic sites and services. So they are living without running water, without electricity. 1 billion people. That increases every year by 37 million, roughly. These are UN numbers. It'll get to 1.5 billion conservatively by 2020, and 2 billion by 2050. And forced evictions, which is the measure of secure tenure, is really a huge issue and is going to become more and more important as people are evicted in order to do more development, whether it's for mining or factories or whatever. Security tenure is the cornerstone of shelter. We can't do it without it. We define secure tenure based upon people not having title to their land, but people who are not subject to being forced off their land. And I actually got to witness it. It's just horrible what happens when that occurs. Most informal settlements around the world don't have legal security. The impact is greatest on women and other vulnerable populations. Dana and I were talking earlier about Roma populations in Central Asia. Whoever the least desirable people are going to be shunted off to the least desirable land, and when that land becomes even remotely desirable, it will be taken from them. and that's just the way of the world. For women in particular, inheritance rights play a huge issue, because when a man divorces his wife willy-nilly, women and children are thrown off the land. When the husband dies, the woman and children are thrown off the land unless she happens to want to marry her brother-in-law. I've had 2 brothers-in-law, and I just, I'd have left the land. But whatever it is, and I liked them fine. I just couldn't have really gotten into bed with them. At any rate, but the World Bank in Africa says it's between 90 and 98% that don't have formal title or former tenure. In Haiti, as we'll talk about more, 95% of the land does not have the kind of documentation. 95% of the land does not have the kind of documentation that we would expect and we have on our land in the United States. And it is 1 hour and 20 minutes by airplane from Miami. So how does Habitat address these staggering needs? I am talking prospectively and to some extent aspirationally. Our model is changing from being a single house to being a community development model globally, and we've taken on doing additional activities. In the center there, that is Jimmy Carter. The former President Carter, when he finished his time in the White House, took on Habitat as the only NGO that he committed. He gives us a week a year. He also created the Carter Center that does amazing democracy work and fights diseases and does mental health issues. But the only NGO to which he has a commitment, ongoing commitment, is Habitat. He gives us a week a year and has done it for 31 years. I'm going to build with him and Rosalind and 250 or 300 of his closest friends in Nepal in November. And he is going by then to be 91 years old. I mean, he's just the most amazing human being. But it's not fun being on the Carter House. It's fun being on the Carter House because Garth Brooks, does anybody know Garth Brooks? Musician Garth Brooks, Trisha Yearwood. Garth Brooks is always on the Carter House, and Garth is just the coolest guy in the world. But Carter barks. And I was on the house that he was building on in Los Angeles, looking over the harbor. It wasn't a pretty view of the harbor. It was the industrial part of the harbor, throwaway piece of land that was falling down the hill. We got it to build some Habitat houses as a Carter build. And I was assigned to the Carter House. And it was a house where we were doing siding. And Carter's job was to cut the siding. And my job was to take the measurements to the president and say, this is what you should cut. And then I would wait there, and then I would be one of 2 or 3 people carrying the piece of siding back. It was mostly okay, except the time that I brought it back to say, we've tried for the last 35 minutes, and we can't make what you cut fit. Could you please adjust the cutting? And his answer was, no, make it fit. And it was just like, okay, we will take it back. And we put it aside. When he left later in the day, we had somebody else recut it. But he's a prickly guy. It was just the most amazing thing in the world. But he works harder in those work sites. He's 90-something years old. He can be as grouchy as he wants. And because of the association with Carter, unless you are Jewish, he is not loved by the Jewish community because he's seen as being pro-Arab. But he's an amazing Habitat volunteer. We now do housing microfinance. Rockefeller gave us money to do a study on whether the Grameen kind of housing, microfinance that you're familiar with was available for housing. It's basically not. So we created something called Microbuild. And it's now a $50 million fund with money from OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, to do housing microfinance, which is a little longer term. We do water and sanitation projects. Basically, if you live someplace where you don't have running water and don't at least have a pit latrine, we don't consider you to be living in decent shelter. So we will do projects that are sometimes just water projects. Our growth over the last 10 years has been from 20,000 houses a year to a very large multiple of that, and it's mostly driven by disasters. Our largest country is the Philippines, and if you see the Philippines in the news, or is anybody from the Philippines here? Okay. We are the largest home builder in the Philippines. We build 40,000 houses a year in the Philippines, not in connection with disaster. And when the Philippines government put together the model for low-income housing, they had us design it. The low-income housing got eclipsed because the standard of living went up over the 10 years we've been working there, and they came back and asked us to do a new model for low-income housing in the Philippines. So it's just amazing, but we can't keep up with the floods. I mean, you live in the most remarkable country in good ways and bad and challenging. Habitat Resource Centers I will talk about down below, but it's basically a new model for service delivery of not building a house, but providing a center in a slum or in a community for the community to help itself. In addition, Habitat uses its voice. As Helen said, my title was Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Government Affairs. I got to start the advocacy program. We did it by stealing shamelessly from Save the Children and Bread for the World and Mothers Against Drunk Driving and AARP and other organizations that brought about transformative change by advocacy. And Habitat now, 8 years after we launched it, is actually making a difference. We're doing it on the basis of data. We don't just go out and advocate because we feel like it. We do research, we do studies. It's based upon specific community needs. It's done on a local basis. It's tied to our micro-lending. We've actually just launched for the first time a global campaign. We got a grant last week of $1.5 million to do a global campaign on secure tenure, and we had an ad agency come up with the slogan, and it's on solid ground. So you'll, I hope, be hearing more about that. What did Habitat do last year? As I told you, we had gotten exponential growth. 10 years ago, we were serving 20,000 families. Last year, we served 757,237 individuals. So it doesn't quite correlate to the house units. And in addition, we impacted positively, and both of these numbers are really conservative because we're afraid of Charity Navigator and other people that count and double count and whatnot. So they're very conservative numbers that we impacted 1.5 million. So if you go back to where we were of over 30, whatever, 1976, 36 years, 38 years of impacting 3 million people. Last year, we impacted almost that many because we've changed our model. This is where we work. Africa was much darker when I started, but we had to close a lot of programs because of corruption and leadership issues. So this slide, I got to go back. How does the world work? Part of my theory, remember, was to recognize the assets that people have and to help people work within their own communities. So you need to know what people actually do. And most people come from the outside and say, oh, they build shelters, they build houses. Most people in the developing world build houses as they have money. So they'll build a room at a time, they'll build a roof at a time. If you go around the developing world, all the houses have rebar sticking up, reinforced steel sticking up, and that's in case they get more money or they have a daughter-in-law or something, and they just save up the money and they build on top. So no building is ever finished. But our graphic department did a really nice graphic of how at least 70% of the world actually builds their homes. Isn't that cool? Isn't that cool? Anybody want me to run it again? Yes, no? All All right, I'll move on. One of the amazing things about the completed house is that there is a door, and the door will have a lock. And that is a transforming factor, particularly for women. This is where we do our advocacy around the world, but we try to do it under the umbrella mostly of secure tenure and gender issues, but we do it with a local voice. I've got a couple of examples of our advocacy. In Mexico, we've got a very good NGO, affiliated entity, and they worked to change the housing program to make it accessible to Habitat families. And that benefited 9,000 Habitat families. It benefited 10 times that number of families across Mexico, but there were 9,000 Habitat families. And in the meantime, as we often do, we ask for a change in the regulation or law, but we also then ask for more money. And we were able to get an increase of $18 million of subsidy. And if you think in Haiti, devastated house, it'll cost $7,000 to build a house. Or if you look in Mexico, where they have a program of clean floor, clean roof, that's $500. 18.4 million is just a huge subsidy increase and big deal. That's our logo for our solid ground. I can't wait to meet those women. In the area of gender rights, which is something can't imagine why, but I'm a little passionate about. We do work on women's land rights specifically, and I have the privilege in 3 weeks to go and talk again, 4th year in a row, at the World Bank Land and Poverty Conference, which is done every year for 14,000 of my closest friends. And it's an amazing group of people, scholars and practitioners that come together to look at land issues, and gender is one of the tracks this year, so I'll be talking about it. I have been part and have been a leader of all of the projects except the Cambodia. I've just been a support system on that one, but the other ones have been integral to my work for the last 9 years. Bolivia, has anybody been to Cochabamba, Bolivia? Did you like it? It's a very cool area. Cochabamba, it took me so long to be able to pronounce it. At any rate, Habitat got a grant from DFID. DFID is the USAID of the UK. And we started a school, and it was called the Women's School on Advocacy and Land Rights, roughly translated. And there were 192 graduates of the school. 180 of them were women, and 12 of them were men because they got tired of being excluded from the curriculum, and they basically stormed it, and we had 12 male graduates. The grant was a 3-year grant from DFID, and we actually had no idea how it was going to work. We've now replicated this program in other countries. We had no idea how it was going to work. But the dynamic, and I love being in Bolivia. I don't know how tall you are, but I'm not tall. And, but I'm tall in Bolivia. I am really tall in Bolivia, even with the women with the bowler hats on. And these are just the feistiest, most amazing women in the world. And we had been working with them on building, and then we got to the next area of land, and we couldn't build for them because they didn't own the land. And there wasn't security of tenure. And there were some laws on the books that weren't clear, and our donors weren't sure that we could, at any rate. So we went about changing the law. But it didn't do any good, as I hope you're hearing the theme. It's not about our changing the law. It's about the community itself changing the law. So what we needed to do was send in a few people who were really smart, and we've got this wonderful Peruvian woman who does this, based in Lima. But she went and she lived in Cochabamba for a while. And she taught the people how to set up a school. She taught people about the rights. She got some volunteer Bolivian lawyers and figured out what was broken about the system. And then the group of, this fierce group of women got together and decided that we thought they were going to change the law for the area, for the province. And then they said, no, we're going to do it like for the whole county. And then one of them, I can't remember her name, I can picture, she said, it's the same in the county that my relatives are from. we're going to change the national law. And we had a 3-year grant. By the end of the second year, they had changed the law in Bolivia. I mean, they changed the bloody law. Nobody thought they could do it, but they put a coalition together of 192 people, creating a working group of 300, active lobbying coalition of 3,000. They changed the law, which positively impacted 1.8 million Bolivian women. Now, the coolest thing about Bolivia, which is why I always start with it, I either start or end with it, is because they were brilliant. They changed the law, which was that women's names weren't allowed to be on the title. Couldn't, you know, didn't matter. They changed it so that not only were women's names allowed to be on the title, but if the man didn't put the woman's name on the title, his title was invalid. And so it had this instantaneous self-enforcing mechanism. And the change has just been immensely profound. So I get really excited about it. Multiple trips to Cochabamba. In the meantime, Habitat is a follow-up because we like doing the actual work, but we then like working either ourselves or with other groups to actually get it implemented on the ground in ways that we could add value. And we've worked, sent in a small team to work, and we've actually gotten regularized title, so secured tenure for 15,000 women. We trained women surveyors, which is a model we haven't replicated but need to replicate elsewhere. We caused the women to do their own community mapping and community enumeration so that everybody who lived in and around where they were actually had an address for the first time. Their shacks were numbered, and their assets were counted. And then we provided technical assistance, including paralegal kind of assistance, so they could get their documentation, which then entitled them to get loans. Because you can't get a loan often unless you have a savings co-op or you've got some kind of documentation, and this had a profound change. Honduras is another huge success. Remember I told you I witnessed an eviction? I didn't quite witness eviction. I was with a bunch of gringos. I, a gringo, was with other gringos, and we were talking to a group of community leaders about their property. And it was a community like this, and they were doing a mapping exercise. It was actually a slightly flatter area. They were doing a mapping exercise, and they were working with members of the county government. And while we were there, at a distance that is about as far away as the building over there, they pointed, and you could see at the top of this cliff is too broad a term, but you could see little stick figures up top. And somebody got a camera lens and said, well, those are military. And the guy that I was with said, as long as you gringos are here, they won't come and throw us off our land. And he said that, and we asked him to repeat it. And I gotta say, when he said it, I thought he was joking. I thought it was exaggerated. And we left on a Wednesday because we were going back up to Washington to do a lobby day to talk about what we'd learned, among other things. And Friday, while we were still in Washington, we got clips and videos that at 6 o'clock in the morning, at gunpoint, the community that we'd been in, the kids and the women were taken out at gunpoint, including this guy in a wheelchair. At any rate, and everything was burned to the ground. And they burned it instead of bulldozing as they normally do because the squatter settlement had resettled itself a couple of times. And they said, we don't want you to do this anymore. We're burning it. The ridiculous thing was this was a group of people that was semi-legitimate. They were working with the county government. And the building materials had actually come from the government. And when homeless people in I've forgotten the city. When homeless people in the local community were homeless, they were taken here so that they could start a new life as a squatter in this kind of quasi-legitimate. But somebody from the federal government had a federal order from somebody who claimed she owned the land. Her brother happened, we found out later, to be the judge. And these families were thrown off. We were in Washington, and we went crazy. We raised holy hell, both in Honduras and in Washington at the various embassies. And 2 weeks later, of the 300 approximately families, about 178 were back on the land. But you just, I do work, and you will do work, and you think, it's abstract, I'm reading books. It's not real. But when you're breaking bread with somebody in a wheelchair, because he was like a contra-rebel, he was part of the revolutionary time, and he's thrown off the land at gunpoint 48 hours, 72 hours after you've been there, it's just too real. But of course, you guys can make a difference. You will make a difference. But you have to be in that community to know those people, to know what their needs are, to be able to raise holy hell in an effective way. In Honduras, the other thing about Honduras was, based upon our original experience, we had created a tool with the help of a Princeton professor named Solly Angel, and it was a tracking tool to track the policies impacting secure tenure and land rights. And it's a very sophisticated tool, and it's actually been adopted by the UN and is being used in some communities. But we tested it in 46 communities in Honduras. So we took the tool and paid somebody to go and ask the people in the community what the answers to the question. And the questions were, what does the regulation say, and actually what really happens in your community. So it's both the perception and the reality, what we call legal and customary. And so the GHI, the Global Housing Policy Indicator scan was used, and we then took what we learned and went to the municipalities and said, you got to change your own municipal rules. And they'd say, why? And we'd say, because we have these data. These data show, and we had this very cool tool. And so based upon this work, there were 46 municipalities out of 60-something within a year that had actually changed their policies to be pro-poor. And then we went back and got a small grant to study this because it was so remarkable. And of the 10 municipalities that we studied, so you could extrapolate for a much bigger impact, there was an increased investment at the municipal level of new funds of $2.3 million and approximately 100,000 people impacted. So got to feel cool about that. Got to feel good about that. So now I'm returning to my thesis. Anybody remember? Okay. Things are bad. Things have to get better. How do they get better? They get better because of new coalitions doing at least 4 different things. One is looking at communities as having assets that need to be deployed, having communities set their own priorities, making sure you have a meaningful commitment to capacity building that results, and that you go from aid to accompaniment. So, assets. The first asset here, I couldn't resist. I think, I don't know the number of, we call it slums, informal settlements. I don't know how many I've been in because I've spent a lot of time in them because that's part of my job. But I will tell you, the people that I meet there are the most amazing people in the world. I mean, how many of us could live on $1 a day? I mean, live on $1 a day. And there are, in Haiti, there were 1.8 million people that were displaced and were living in tents. Their kids would come out of a dirt floor, tarpaulin-covered tent. And their kids would come out in their school uniforms with little white ribbons. And they would be fed. Not fed well, and there might be a ribbon or two missing, but the ingenuity, the fortitude, the sense of humor, I mean, I just can't begin to tell you how amazing it is. This is a picture from the Philippines, and I will tell you some of the most awful slums I visited are along rivers. It makes it just everything even more difficult. But ingenuity is an amazing asset. I picked a non-habitat asset-based development to talk about quickly because I thought it was a really good example of multiple factors. Partners in Health, Paul Farmer, as I talked about earlier, was doing work before the earthquake, after the earthquake, in which in 7 seconds, 233,000 people died. People didn't even know what funeral to go to. I mean, it was just 233,000 people died in 7 seconds. at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 4:53 in the afternoon, 5 years ago, last 12th of January, 2010. And 1.8 million people immediately lost where they were living. The epicenter was about 10 kilometers from Port-au-Prince. A third of the country lives in Port-au-Prince. So there was nobody in the country that wasn't impacted, and the impact was profound. Interestingly, the impact was both rich and poor. Most of the time you think of things, and Philippines is a good example, where the poor are the ones who have the fewest assets and they're wiped out. In Haiti, there were no building codes. So if you were really rich, you had a construction of a house that had walls and ceilings and walls and ceilings, and the ceilings were made of stone, but there were no rebar requirements. And so the rich people got pancaked just like the poor people. In fact, more rich people got pancaked from the heavy structures coming down. And of the 8 major ministries of the government, 7 were leveled. And 9 out of 10 ministers and social service employees were out of a job or out of a building or both. Paul Farmer was on the first plane back in, and among other things that he found in the long work of not just responding to the emergency but ongoing, was that almost 100% of the kids that came in for treatment in his clinics and his hospital were malnourished. And 50% of the Haitian school-age children are malnourished. That would be good if you didn't know as well that only 50% of the kids in Haiti go to school. So the malnourishment issues are just, it's just toe curling. But there is a solution, not developed in Haiti, but there's a solution called ready-to-use therapeutic food. And it's basically peanuts. It's various versions of smashed peanuts. And right after the earthquake, everybody was trying to import this MASH, this RTUF. And Paul Farmer said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm serving more kids than anybody else, and I'm going to cause my local farmers who have some local peanut production to increase the peanut production, to create a new local recipe that'll actually attract more people because it's local tastes, and we're going to do our own RTUF. And he did, and it was the perfect example of saying Haiti as a country is an agricultural country. It has assets, it has farmers, it has agronomists. In this case, Abbott Laboratories, remember talking about coalitions, bringing people together. Paul Farmer can attract anybody, bugs to the light. Abbott came in with the funding. They created a production facility, and as after the first year in the newest, larger facility, which is 3 generations, they had produced 90,000 kilograms of I'm dyslexic. It should be RTUF. The distribution is actually continuing this year, and interestingly, TechnoServe, which is, I think, a company out in this part of the world, at any rate, tech company, has joined the coalition and is setting up a distribution system and doing it on a commercial basis, so the farmers can actually get paid. So again, if you're talking about leaving behind, you have to know what the assets are, you have to deploy them, add some magic juice to it, but then have the coalition help people be better off. And in this case, it's both sustainable peanut mash production, but also a supply chain for constant production of peanuts. I will run out of time before I get through all my illustrations, so I'm going to speed it up. Community engagement is a process. For your edification, you need to look on the internet for something called Slum Dwellers International, sometimes called Shack Dwellers International. Habitat stole shamelessly, as has other NGOs, the methodology they use for community engagement. It is a detailed, formulaic process. It's adaptable in almost any community, and it's great. We've done it around the world. We did it in Colombia, and we did it in partnership with the United Nations UN Habitat, testing a new tool where part of the exercise of engaging people on the mapping of the community adds GPS and Google Map. So people are actually taking a open source software, and instead of just mapping communities and getting the community engaged in their own democracy and their own priority setting, doing it using this very powerful open source tool. It was so much fun. And these little pink slips related to what the community committed without any new assets, what it was going to do based upon the data that it learned from this mapping exercise. And then the white things were what Habitat and the Catholic Church we were working with said that they would do. But this is, each of those little dots in there is a shelter of sorts. And then we had a party, and we celebrated because it was such a wonderful community process. Oh, and the women dancing there, I'm 63. There wasn't anybody that was under 70 that was dancing, and they were just having a hoot. But anyway, alleviating poverty in Haiti. Again, I probably should just give you some sites. Simone Pillay is our signature project. It's the one thing that we've done as well as anywhere, and we're exporting the work that we did at the community level from Haiti to other places around the world. And I start my Haiti law talks when I just talk about the law saying, if you could do it in Haiti, you could do it anywhere. Same is true for community engagement. Everything's so difficult in Haiti. But we've trained people, we've done capacity building, we've gotten livelihoods set up, we've gotten community contracting going so that there are these little building entrepreneurs that are going out and doing competitive bids. And we've done it out of these, remember I had the picture of the Habitat Resource Center? We've had an actual physical location in the slum from which all these activities are taking place. So again, it's the community helping itself. And people like me are called blancs down in, there are no blancs in our resource centers, except for the first one beautiful blanc who set up the thing in the first place. The Property Law Working Group is the thing of which, you know, I think God gives you chance. I'm a strong Christian, and I don't know what your faith is, but I do think in life one has chances, and you look back and you say, what an amazing thing to have had the privilege to be part of. I attribute that to faith, but it could be attributed in a secular context as well. I got frustrated because I wanted land that Habitat could use to build houses after the earthquake. We always want money from our donors, and the American Red Cross said, we will give you $1 gazillion if you can come up with some land. And we built where we could get land, but we couldn't get clarity on land. And I literally, I'm a really obnoxious person, and I went and talked to everybody, and nobody was fair game. I talked to senators, I talked to people who were Haitian, I talked to international people, I flew places, and I said, how do you deal with Haiti land rights? We want to build these houses. And a lot of people just shrugged their shoulders, but I knew that Haitians were actually buying and selling land. I knew that there was a formula, that things were actually happening, but it was inscrutable. I don't know if that's the right word. I couldn't get through. So I did the best I could, got everybody in that I could, and then I sent out an email to 24 people saying, I have spent 18 months trying to figure this out. Does anybody want to work with me to try and figure out, get the answer to this? Anybody else want clarity on this? Anybody else in? And I got 24 yes answers. And the 24 people that answered represented 24 different institutions, the World Bank, the IDB, every Haitian law firm I could find, 2 agencies of the Haitian government, the Canadians, some French folks, some private sector folks. And we started meeting, as the note says, in English. I was the founder of the group. I don't really speak very much French. We were meeting in English. I kind of set up the bylaws. We had meetings, minutes in French. Minutes in English. Then the minutes started getting translated into French. Then we started having English and French dialogue and translations back and forth. Now the group is still meeting. It has more than 150 organizations that are part of it, more than 250 participants. The meetings are all now in French and Creole, and I made a deal that if I ever got my USAID grant to support the project, that USAID asked me to apply for in October of 2011, if I ever got it, I would take French lessons. I retired from Habitat December 1, and on December 19, I got the USAID grant. So the 1st of January, I started French lessons. So I will eventually be back leading the group in French, but in the meantime, I just wash my Haitian. And the meetings are fabulous, but when I go, in fact, I've gone to all but one when I had a plane problem. I'm the only Blanc in the room. And it's Haitian lawyers, Haitian notaries, Haitian government agencies, and it is the best of what the work is that you guys need to be looking forward to doing, which is to catalyze, to inspire, to cajole, to push, to threaten, and seed. And we've written 2 manuals. The first manual on how to buy and sell land, and then I was asked to do Duke has a Haiti lab, and I was asked to come and talk about the first manual, and I said to the group of people, I was working on a second manual, and it was on securing land rights, and it was going to talk about squatters' rights and secure tenure, and one of the Haitian diaspora who was there said, they will never let you write that book. They will never let you put clarity. They will never let you put the light of day on that. And this is the picture of the first manual. And this is the second manual, and it's getting officially launched in Haiti on the 17th of March. It's in French only, and the USAID grant will help us write it in a version in English and Creole. And amazing things are happening, but it's because it doesn't have anything to do with me, and it really doesn't have anything to do with Habitat. It's about Haiti. The last illustration I have is Habitat's, I think, future coup de grace. And if this happens the way I hope it will, it ties everything together that I've talked about. And if it does happen, I need Helen to invite me back. It'll be 3 to 5 years from now, or somebody else back to talk and show the pictures of what actually happens. Haiti's original effort after the disaster involved just shameless waste and harm. And a new ambassador came in whose name is Pamela White, and she uses truck driver language, and she is absolutely a pistol, and she's irreverent, and she showed up uninvited to talk to the Senate and the Parliament wearing sandals, and was criticized because she didn't ask nicely to come and wore sandals. I mean, but she will just go through any wall, including a wall of fire, to get things done. And Habitat and other what I would call good players started working on Pam as soon as she arrived in Haiti, which was in 2012. And she came to the Jimmy Carter build that we were working on, building houses with President Carter, President and Mrs. Carter, and Garth Brooks and whatnot, in Santo, Leogán, epicenter of the earthquake. And she came, and I thought it was going to be one of those waves. She came, and she spent the whole day there. And she got blonde hair, and it was filled with paint, orange and blue paint. I mean, she just looked hysterical, but she was totally committed. And in the course of it, we were able to tell her what our methodology is, which is you have to find out what the assets are. You have to listen to what the community says. You have to honor them. You have to do your work in a way that leaves the community behind. And you have to walk with people, not give things away. She, 6 months after she got there, had to go to the US Senate for some really dodgy hearings because the US government had wasted, and I could take all night with my vitriolic summary of the waste, but she had to defend it. And she defended it, towed the party line. But she took me and a couple other people to dinner afterwards, and she said, never again. And I said to her, oh, Pam, that's awfully nice. And she said, no, I listened to you. I heard you, and we're changing our policy. And I sent back a little note the next day saying, oh, you were so nice and flattering at dinner last night to give me credit. I'm sure everybody was, been moving along. She said, no, Liz, you changed our mind, and we have changed the policy in Haiti. And we are doing a new project. And again, this isn't about me. This is about the way Habitat does things, having stolen shamelessly from SDI. We are doing community engagement. We are not putting USAID money in another dam, and she used more words, another dam project in Haiti unless the community has been enumerated, the community is engaged, it's the community's priorities. And I said, God bless, this is great. And where they picked is an area called, interestingly, called Canaan. And the area next to Canaan, Promised Land, is Jerusalem. And so these two adjacent areas called Jerusalem and Canaan, which would otherwise look like a gravelly desert, is an area that was declared for eminent domain for development right after the earthquake. The government then changed, so the eminent domain actually never went through, but the squatters were smart enough to think, hey, there was an eminent domain, I'm going to go out and put a tent up there in case there is ever any settlement or land or anything handed out. I want to be there first. That was in March of 2010 was the eminent domain order. As of now, there are almost 22,000 people, 22,000 families who live in Canaan. And they, over time, built, and they started under blue tarpaulins, and every time I would go, I would see their blue tarpaulins, and then they would start, and they would create these little cinder block houses, and then I'd come back later, and there'd be roads and stuff like that. And what is right now is a city. I mean, it's a city of 100,000 people. It's a city of 100,000 people created by the people themselves using their own assets. So in trying to convince people that it was worth having the government come in and put sites and services in, you have to say, well, why would we do it? And we said, well, because these communities have created their own thing, and if you don't put sites and services in, it will become a slum. So you're either doing mitigation or you're helping these families just take it to the next level. You just need water and some sewer. A lot of the construction's done. They said, well, how do we know a lot of construction's done? So IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, hired helicopters and assessors to fly over the 20,900 houses. And they did a physical assessment of the blocks, the bricks, the cement, the roofs, the signage, and stuff like that. There are 138 local businesses, there are schools, there are churches. And they determined conservatively that $100 million of investment had been made by the poor in building their own homes. And based upon that investment, it's the least that they could do as a government, the Haiti government, to come in and put in some infrastructure. And USAID said, you do it, but you do it our way with community engagement, and we'll help pay for it. And that's what's going on. We will make sure, because Habitat's one of the entities that is, it's going to be a small part of the community engagement strategy, but we're also going to be putting in and hoping to get some bids for doing some training and some teaching on how to go from aid to empowerment and make sure that what we leave behind is a community that we're all really proud of and really incorporates these new value systems. So that's the end of my remarks, and thank you for being so attentive. I didn't see anybody fall asleep, and I'm very grateful, and I'm happy to answer questions. And thank you for the claps. Yep. Yeah, great.
Well, thank you very much for that, first of all. It, I believe, spoke to the heart and minds of a lot of the people here. Many people in this audience are very deeply engaged with community engagement issues, and it spoke very much to my heart, so I have many questions for you. First of all, given the fact that we have a multidisciplinary audience here tonight, people from all different departments and within Stanford and outside of Stanford, and given that you yourself come from a diverse background in the corporate world,
yep.
Can you speak to how your background in corporate actually positioned you in Habitat, what you believe that brought to you and to the organization, and also if you could do it over again, would you?
I'll answer the second question first. Yes, I would do it again. And I actually feel like all the things that I was able to do in the many jobs that I had before Habitat actually taught me something that I was able to try to harness at Habitat. Nonprofits, it's a myth that nonprofits, particularly big international nonprofits, are major businesses. I mean, Habitat itself raises $1.5 billion a year. Now, the part of Habitat I was part of, Habitat International, raised about $400 million a year. Doing business in 70 countries, being responsible for $1.5 billion annually of activity, I mean, it's a major corporate undertaking. And I think my corporate background helped a lot in two regards. One is it helped me with the metrics I mentioned before and kind of driving in a project management kind of way that is more customary in the private sector. And then the second is it gave me license to not take no for an answer. I mean, it's so easy. It's so easy to just wring your hands and say, oh, well, we can't do that. You know, we're only Habitat. And the answer is, yeah, we're only Habitat, but I know so-and-so, and don't you know so-and-so, and Dow Chemical's been giving us money for 30 years. Well, why don't we ask Dow to help? You know, I mean, it gave me permission just not to take no for an answer. And I think that's important because it wasn't about me, and I would continue today. I mean, I'm working as a volunteer, going twice. I'm going on my 51st and my 52nd trip to Haiti next month, and nobody's paying me to do it. It's the right thing to do. And when you feel that way, then you just kind of, that extra hour or that extra drive, it comes easily.
Thank you. That leads into another question of mine. Actually, last week we had Mark Laurie here from World Vision.
Oh, yeah. That's a great organization.
One of the questions that we had for him was, how do faith-based organizations differ from secular organizations? And my question for you is, other than a religious calling, how would you say that the work of Habitat is different from a secular-based organization?
Well, if you actually look at INGOs around the world, most of them, not all of them, actually started with some kind of religious background. And it's not necessarily just Christian. You know, the American Jewish Federation is just a phenomenal organization. There are phenomenal organizations that are Hindu-based. I have a brother raised as a Catholic who's married to a Muslim and is himself a Buddhist, and he has, I mean, there are just lots of organizations. So what a morals-based organization can do doesn't matter so much whether it was started as faith-based or actually continues. I do, however, think that there's a huge problem that's underway that may be worse in a secular context, but is happening anyway, which is NGOs, and it's true for a lot of companies and other institutions, are best in the founder era, because the founder will do anything to make things happen, to have their vision. So the ones that survive usually have their heyday in the founder, sometimes the founder and then just a little bit. After that, organizations start to exist to further themselves. And once an organization is making a decision so that Habitat is around or World Vision is around, as opposed to the mission being accomplished through whatever mechanism, there is a tendency to have institutions become monolithic and detached from the passion and mission. And unfortunately, I think, you know, I'm not an anthropologist and I'm not a social psychologist, but I do know that that exists. And if you look at leadership studies, that's a real problem that leaders have, of trying to keep the passion and the moral compass going, secular or not. where an institution starts becoming institutionalized and bureaucratic.
Do you believe that because the Habitat Board of Directors is entirely Christian, although non-denominational, that this actually does lend to some of the issues that you were just addressing?
Yeah, Habitat, World Vision, let me just step back. World Vision is a church and is actually licensed as a church. Habitat is not, and Habitat has to go through a test, therefore, that we can't discriminate based upon religion. And therefore, if we are requiring, it's not just our directors, but our the direct reports to the CEO, are all required to be Christian. And the question is there a justification for that? And in the 9 years that I was actively part of the senior management team, 9+, the issue of the Christian roots and the Christian declaration and the Christian leadership and the board members being Christian came up 3 or 4 different times. And each time the board and leadership did a study, and they looked at organizations that had started as Christian and had become secular, and the feeling of the board and the leadership was that the risk of going secular and therefore losing the moral compass didn't make it worth it. And so there was each time a recommitment to the Christian structure. I will reiterate, though, that Habitat is it's an action-based organization. It's a non-proselytizing organization. So we don't try to convert people, and we serve people and partner with people of all faiths and no faith, and but we want to make sure we're doing it for the right reasons.
Thank you. Along those lines as well, I couldn't help to notice that within the North Africa and Middle East region, as well as Eastern Europe region, that it seemed that Habitat had shied greatly away from working with many of the Muslim majority countries. And you had mentioned that this might have been due to corruption, but I was wondering if you had something else to offer to that.
Actually, if you look globally, overwhelmingly we serve Muslims. So the countries in which we are largest numbers-wise are in Asia, and overwhelmingly it's countries where the predominant religion is Muslim. And in the Middle East, we have been criticized for shying away from Israel, because we actually have programs in Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon, but we don't have a program, a branded program in Israel. And we actually have a Habitat Middle East, and the closings of the countries have been for programmatic reasons, not for faith-based or population-based reasons.
In the country in which you worked, Serbia,
Yeah.
I noticed that it was strongly funded by the European Union. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about European-funded projects? And sounds like you can.
Yeah, I can. Well, the United States is the most generous country in the world if you look at individual philanthropy. If you look at government philanthropy as a percentage of GDP or any other national metric, the European, particularly the Scandinavian countries, are by far and away more generous. Sometimes in absolute terms, and sometimes, and for sure in percentage terms. With the formation of the EU, there was an effort to try to do a controlling, and instead of kind of leveraging and saying, gee, 1 + 1 is 2, if the Swedes come in and the Germans come in, then the German and Norwegians or Swedes can rationalize. The European Union actually set up a bureaucracy, and Habitat actually had to create a new corporate entity called Nadasia in order for us to be able to apply for European funding, even though we had Habitat European entities that had existed for decades. So they're a pain in the neck. You know, the EU is a pain in the neck to deal with. Having said that, we have started getting some great funding. Our Central Asia programs are weatherization work. The Soviet bloc left just all these, it's not no houses, it's crummy old houses. We have one great program, I think it was Hungary, where we changed the policy so that there's actually too many houses in Hungary, but they're mostly owned by people who won't rent them, and it's mostly a rental market, won't rent them to the undesirables. And so we put a policy in, basically putting a government guarantee so that the people that needed it would get the properties. And so Central Asia is a place where some really interesting stuff is going, and we have a great housing microfinance program there too.
Thank you. Switching gears a bit to what you had been talking about with your women's empowerment programs, since I know that's very important to you specifically.
Yep.
Do you ever get concerned that gender integration and gender equality programs might actually shake the foundations of a culture or a society that could be based very deeply on a kinship system or another system in which it could actually uproot the culture? Have you ever considered that, or does it ever play into your projects?
The project, the kinship systems, and particularly the tribal countries in which I've worked, which are Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, South Africa, and Lesotho, are ones where, as I talked about earlier, where the work that we've done has been tailored to respect the existing tribal system. And but each of the cultures in which I've worked, there are already inroads that are breaking down some of the traditional kinship systems, particularly the ones that are misogynist. And our effort is to kind of ride the small little waves or to tiptoe behind, as opposed to blaring in and saying, we've got something working in Central or South America where there's less of a rigid system. But gender rights are not easy, and whether it's gender or any vulnerable population, it's not easy to address, because if people wanted to address them, they would. So any effort to address them is unsettling, but we haven't found it to be structurally unsettling, if I understood your question.
Yes, absolutely. With regards to community engagement, I often have a fear, and it seems as though you indicated this as well, that social inequalities that might already be present within a community, that community engagement issues, if they're not done correctly, and from my perspective, that is not based off of statistical analysis, not based off of pure metrics or surveys, but a deep anthropological understanding of a community to understand where those inequalities might lie. I fear that sometimes community engagement projects are often very superficial, and that they can actually create more harm within a community than can do good. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to this a bit?
Well, I think I said earlier that there's been lip service paid to a lot of community work, and the lip service projects fit into that latter category you're talking about. I would challenge anybody who follows the methodology that we do and the SDI kind of shack dwellers, slum dwellers kind of methodology. I would challenge anybody to say that that work is superficial. And the reason is that it is, it's intentionally slow. And it's intentionally, there's a checklist, there are certain things, certain steps that are the framework, but it's done in each community at its pace, by its leaders, in its time. And when we got the first, I was talking about Simone Pillay, the slum in Port-au-Prince, that is a real flagship project for us. We got a grant from Canadian CETA to do community engagement. It took us a year to get the community to do its own census. A year. And there are a lot of donors, and people would say at the end of it, what have you done? And the answer is, well, we sent this really beautiful blonde woman who now left us to work for the World Bank and is now with the American Red Cross, but starting a PhD someplace soon. We sent her in to teach the methodology and to train the people. And then her only job after that was to come back and check and be like a resource and a sounding board and a spiritual advisor and an encourager for the people that she trained. And then sometimes the people she trained didn't work, so she'd have to go back and retrain and retrain. And community engagement is hard because you go in with the people that you know who know something about the community, and they tell you who the leaders are. And sometimes those are the leaders, and sometimes they're not. And sometimes even if they are the leaders, they're not good guys, or women occasionally. And so you actually have to work really hard qualitatively to make sure that you're supporting community strengthening that has integrity, that has honesty, that has bought in. And there are a bunch of governance processes that follow on from that, and testing, but it is slow. We didn't do a single house building project in Simone Pillay for more than 24 months after we started engagement. And if I can make one last comment about thinking, when we went into Simone Pillay, and I went in and I've been studying all these slums in Haiti, I walked in and I said, the first tour I had of the community, surrounded by community leaders, I thought, I know the first thing that they have to do. So they're going to get their engagement going, and then they're going to set their priorities, and then they're going to start closing these open sewers. Not a real rocket science, and that's what we've done in so many communities. And we got their first priority list. Sewers were not on it. They wanted solar streetlights, and they wanted paving of about 30 meters of rough, water-rutted road. And the water-rutted road was, they had a little bit of commerce going in and out of the slum, and they couldn't get the carts or the vehicles in and out. So paving that just opened them up to a level of external livelihood opportunity. And then the solar lights were to stop the girls in the precarious situations from getting raped, because the solar lights were keeping the girls from getting raped at night, which was happening very, very, very frequently in the dark. And once they said that, it was like, all right, we'll wait on the sewers. You got it. It's your priorities. It's your communities. But it's a careful listening process that gets those lights up.
I have one final question before I turn it over to the audience, and this was with regards to a New York Times article in 2007 that came out regarding a possible tithing policy.
Habitat tithing?
Yes. And I was hoping that you might be able to speak to us about if there is a tithing policy. It seemed as though affiliates had been let go because they were not tithing, but there wasn't an actual tithing policy in place, and I was hoping you could clarify.
Okay, so the reason there was that article was because of, it isn't all about me, but in this case it was all about me, because I came as the general counsel to Habitat, and Habitat has a $4 billion brand, 98% positives, and when I got there, there was no license for what was a $4 billion trademark. And I said, that's just not acceptable. And so we went and basically put an affiliation agreement in between Habitat International, which owns the brand, and the affiliates. Somebody described the process at the end charitably, and 2007 was the time frame, described it charitably as trying to put a prenup in 20 years into a marriage. So we got sued, we got pilloried in newspaper articles that were actually not particularly accurate, and it was because of this shifting sand of trying to hold a federation accountable so it could move forward. In point of fact, Habitat has had a tithing covenant since it was formed in '76. Tithing is a Christian concept of you give 10%, and it had been part of the founding of the ministry. It was honored in its breach, and when we started looking at the tithing, affiliates across the board on average were tithing between 2 and 3%. And they were coming up with excuses of what was an exclusion from a tithe and whatnot. So part of the process of saying the affiliation agreement is this, and this is what you have to do, was to write it all down for the first time. It still is voluntary. So Habitat International cannot and will not get rid of an affiliate that isn't tithing. Habitat International does, however, raise about $150 million a year of in-kind resources and contributions that go through Habitat International to the affiliates. And if the affiliate does not want to tithe, they are not eligible to participate in the pass-through programs. Some affiliates did quit, but tithe was the discussion or excuse. It wasn't.
Thank you.
It wasn't the reason. So,
Thank
in
you
my
for
judgment.
that.
So.
Okay, well, we have just enough time for 1 or 2 questions or more if you'd like to stay. So.
Hi, thank you for speaking this evening. My question has to do with Habitat's country selection. So in the map that you presented about Habitat's involvement around the world, I noticed that most of the problem spots in Africa weren't actually covered. And you mentioned that this was because of corruption and leadership issues. And my question is, if the moment of leaving is also when the aid and shelter is needed most, what is the discussion and the dialogue around the decision to move out? And also, is there constant monitoring to see if there's a moment when re-entrance is possible?
Your question is excellent and propitious. And the chairman of our board and I have been working on trying to raise additional funding, particularly from Coca-Cola, to expand or re-expand our Africa program. The programs where we closed were corruption, and that was in 3 instances, and the people who were running the program and their subordinates, so there wasn't like a succession plan, went to jail. So this isn't just kind of mild, we think somebody's got a hand in the till. 3 or 4 of the countries we closed because of violence. So we were in Sudan, we were in Liberia, we were in Nigeria, and those were simple physical safety, because remember, we have volunteer-driven programs. So we have 40+ countries where we actually send volunteers from Europe or from the United States principally in, and there was physical safety issues. 2 countries closed because the funding dried up, and the funding actually came through from a President Bush program called PEPFAR, Presidential Emergency Relief Program for AIDS Relief. And we snuck Habitat orphan housing in as a PEPFAR program for AIDS relief, and we kind of got caught and said, you know, you're not really delivering any AIDS medicine, you're helping orphans. And so we basically got shut out, so the funding, once the funding stream, and Mozambique is an example of a country where that happened. We do re-examine, but I would say that our board chair and I are not satisfied with the level of re-examination. But the board is going next week to Cape Town, and part of the strategy is to take the board to Cape Town, and the board will be spending a week in Africa. And it's, again, to enlighten them. And she and I, the board chair and I, went to Zambia and South Africa to prepare for the trip. And so it's a hard issue. It's a hard issue, but a great question. Yes, ma'am.
Similar to her question, I'm from Venezuela, and I noticed that the map, the only country that in South America that isn't represented is Venezuela.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you knew and could tell us a little bit about why that's been an issue to
We're
work
not
there.
welcome, is the short answer. We actually do some projects with Techo, which is I think it started as a Peruvian. We have some non-branded, unbranded work that we do in Venezuela, but most American NGOs are not welcome. Their currency issues, their visa issues, but that's the reason. Otherwise, we have just fabulous work that we're doing all around Central and South America. I love going down there. Thank you, you brave few who stuck it out to the end. I appreciate it very much. It's been an honor to be able to visit with you and talk to you. And my email, if anybody needs it, you're going to get the presentation, but if anybody has any questions, because I retired, but I have 3 sons, my email is lizblake333@gmail.com, so please feel free to email me.
Thank you very much.